here, listening to the pod from wherever you are in the world. Before we dive into today's interview with the very, very knowledgeable and also very personable Julia Jones, I do want to apologise. The very first minute, there's a little buzzy sound in the background, but it does go away. So please don't let it turn you off. Enjoy. Hello and welcome to this episode of the Anna Asks podcast. Today I am in conversation with Julia Jones. Julia is a postpartum doula to begin with, a mother second, chronologically of course, and then her trajectory in the motherhood support and parent support world has gone on a little bit of a different tack. So this is what we are here to explore today. Julia was my postpartum doula teacher. She brings a whole wealth of wisdom and connection across this space to our conversation, and I am very, very pleased to have her company today. So before I get Julia to introduce herself, I would like to acknowledge the country on which I record this podcast, which is a Awabakal country, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. And Julia, would you like to do the same for where you're situated?
Sure, I'm on Wajak Noongar country in the southwest of Western Australia.
Yeah, you're around Fremantle area, aren't you?
Yeah, that's right.
Cool. Well, I'm going to throw the mic to you and get you to tell us a little bit about yourself and your story.
Yeah, well, you did sum it up chronologically. I became a doula before I was a mother because I'd been traveling overseas and seen how different the transition to motherhood was in some other cultures. And I realized that a lot of the challenges that we face are in fact cultural. You know, in our kind of hyper independent Western culture, we assume everything's our own fault. You know, for a long time mums just thought, well, I'm just not trying hard enough, or I'm just not good enough, or there's something wrong with me. But I think what I saw, and I had spent my university years studying social justice, so that was kind of the lens which, you know, I was looking through already. But what I realized is that we could make social changes that would have a big impact on how much mothers not only are happy and healthy, but also then how that impacts on society more broadly as well. So I wanted to train as a postpartum doula, and I actually wanted to learn about Ayurveda too, Indian medicine, which was another kind of area of mine that I was really interested in. But postpartum was where I really found my passion. And at the time, it was really hard to study to be a postpartum doula. It wasn't something people had heard of. We're talking about 15 years ago now. There was no training available in my local town. No one was working in that job. It was just like, I had just seen that this was a thing in other places. And I was like, you know, why don't we do it here? So I was quite determined. I trained online, and back then that meant actually like literally getting posted a binder and going on teleconferencing calls that you had to pay international phone fees to attend, you know. So it was the online education world was very different back then. I actually brought a trainer over from Canada and got a group of people together to cover those costs. I was really, really determined. And then once I started working and really loved it, I had my own children and, you know, years would go by. And eventually people started asking me, how do I get to be what you are? And I was like, well, it's really actually quite a difficult thing to learn about, you know. I was like, well, this online course that I did doesn't exist anymore. And the other training I did, the teacher was from Canada. And, you know, so I just kind of started teaching people just because there wasn't anything else available here. And then that grew and grew. And now I work primarily teaching and primarily online. And we have over 1,000 students in 40 different countries.
Yeah, that's a big number for somebody who didn't actually intend for that to be the direction that or the way your time would be spent. You probably envisaged yourself being in homes with young families, which is kind of what your graduates are spending more time doing now.
Yeah, and I think I'm the kind of person who just goes where the need is. I'm always someone who sees the gaps and just goes, well, if that's what needs doing, then and no one else is
Mm.
doing it. Sometimes I feel kind of relieved when someone else starts a business and I'm like, oh, or
Yeah.
writes a book.
I can
I'm like,
relate to that
oh,
feeling.
great. I don't have to do that bit now, you know?
I was actually speaking our last episode with Zelma from the Postnatal Project, and we were having this same conversation that sometimes you can have this great idea, but it can be such a relief when you see that somebody else has actually taken on that part of the work.
Yes, exactly. So no, it's always like I love that this industry is growing. I love that the kind of understanding of motherhood is becoming more about like a social perspective of motherhood, and that we're realizing that we can make policy changes, and it doesn't have to
Fancy
be
that.
this hard. Yeah. This is a choice, this society that we've built, and we can build a
Mm.
different society that supports mothers better, and that in the last 15 years is definitely becoming a more mainstream understanding.
Yeah, I had no awareness of this 15 years ago, but I can imagine just how much change you've seen in that attitude, that, yeah, as you say, will hopefully filter to a policy level as well.
Yeah, it might take another 15 years,
Mm.
but I'm in it for the long haul.
Yeah. You mentioned over 1,000 students have graduated from your program across 40 different countries. Why do you think some of your graduates are different from others, or perhaps you want to speak on the directions they go in, or what kind of backgrounds, experience that you attract to your
Mm.
courses? Because there are now more options out there. So I suppose I want to dig into why your course feels different, because I know when I was looking around at different options, yours was a standout for me.
Yeah, well, what I was a bit disappointed in my own training that I did way back then was it was really focused on the mother as an individual and the choices she makes in terms of feeding and caring for her baby, really in quite an isolated little context, just in her own home. There was still an emphasis then, I don't know, a little bit less, to be honest. Evidence-based care in some of the trainings I did was a really strong point, but in general, even a general mainstream understanding of evidence-based care was fairly low 15 years ago. I mean, now you see ads for vitamins on television saying that they're based on scientific evidence, whereas I just don't think that was really a thing. Back then, I think the whole woo-woo alternative culture was way more dangerous. We had a lot more people then saying like, herbs can cure cancer and you just need to go on a diet and stuff. So I think that kind of influence was stronger then. So that was kind of like present in the trainings that I did a little bit too. And I've had to unlearn some things that I took for granted, because I'd paid for training with someone who was a professional. And then years later, I've found out, oh, that's actually not true, or it's not true anymore, or we have better evidence now. So I'm constantly kind of updating those skills. And I really encourage my students to be very evidence-based and very flexible in thinking, because there are things that I used to think were true that are not anymore. And a really obvious, easy example of that is all our parents put babies to sleep on their tummy. And then later they were told to put their babies to sleep on their side. And now we know that the safest way is to put babies to sleep on their back. And that's actually been the single biggest reduction in sudden infant death syndrome of any public health campaign we've ever done. So, we have to be open to changing our mind when new evidence comes to light. So evidence-based care is very important to me. But also I think probably the other key differences are the social aspect that I've mentioned, the fact that I really see motherhood in the context of the world that we live in and the kind of support that we get. I don't see it as an independent ambition, as something you just have to try harder at. So I think that's a different perspective. You won't just learn about baby care and feeding. You'll learn about the world that we live in and the society that we work in, and how that is different to other places, for better or for worse. And then finally, one thing that I teach a lot, which is also very kind of new and emerging science, is the biological changes that come along with motherhood. And recently, with a lot of changes to the way we talk about gender, some people have asked me if I am considering changing my name, Newborn Mothers, but I'm not, I don't think, and I will consider, I will continue to consider this and be open to new information. But I do think that what I'm talking about is a combination, really, both of the gendered experience of motherhood, being a woman in the world, but also the biological female sex experience of becoming a parent. And I think if you have one of those experiences and not the other, it's not exactly what I'm talking about. I am talking about both the sex experience and the gendered experience together. And it's quite a complex thing. And I know some people will experience one and not the other. And I think there's still value in my work. And I do try and use more gender inclusive language and things like that. I think what is really different about my work is understanding that there is a biological experience. There are changes that happen in your brain when you're pregnant, when you give birth, when you're breastfeeding. You literally become a different person. And there is also a social experience of becoming a mother that is different for fathers or non-birthing parents, in the way that we return to work and identity and the roles that we're expected to play and that kind of thing. So those are kind of some of the broader sort of philosophical approaches within the course.
And your awareness of some of these issues is probably something that connected with me, and I know that it connects with some of the more so I come from an allied health background, and I notice in your courses there's various students, particularly from like social work and psychology and caring based backgrounds, as well as people who are coming from a place of no previous experience or health training. Perhaps this is the first non-school program that they've ever completed. So there is a broad range. I find it interesting. I actually have wondered as well if you were considering changing your name from Newborn Mothers, because throughout the course there is a real focus on gender inclusive language and awareness of how different families are constructed with different individuals who have different sex characteristics and gender identity and all of those things. And I think, as you were speaking before, as you talk about the biological experience of motherhood and the combination of both a gendered experience and a sexed experience as well, is that to an extent, I don't know that we as biological mothers who identify with the sex that we were assigned at birth can necessarily claim to speak to the experience or the needs of birth fathers either, or non-binary birth parents. And just a note that I think your course provides an excellent foundation in these things, and then we can go and learn from some of those individuals who do work in the queer birth space, if that's something that we want to upskill our practice in as well. It's not like we just do one course and finish. I think often people who are interested in becoming a postpartum doula have interests across a whole range of parent support aspects and almost become like learning junkies in a way, which I know that you are one of those, particularly diving into the topic of baby brain, which is that's the first module in your doula course at the moment, isn't it?
Yes. And it was not something I ever learned in any of my trainings that I've done. It's not something you can study, like I learned about it at a professional development day I did with a pediatrician and lactation consultant called Christina Smiley. That sent me on this track of reading every book I could find on the topic and also enrolling in a neuroscience course, but it wasn't something that you learn when you typically do postpartum or birth work. It's not something was in any of the other courses that I did in this field.
Yeah. Do you want to give us a 1 or 2 minute summary on the baby brain? Obviously, you're not going to give us all of your first module content, but for those listening who have no idea what we're on about, do you want to give a little intro, taster?
Yes. And just to finish off on the sex and gender stuff, I think that's a really good point. I'm not the best person to really teach about that because it's not my experience. But I also wonder if one day our language will change. It's changing so fast already that maybe there will be a word I can use instead of mother to mean what I'm saying. But right now, if I switched out for parent, it wouldn't be
It's not quite
accurate.
accurate across the
Yeah,
spectrum.
yeah.
Yeah.
We're not there yet. I don't know what that's going to look like in the future. So that's why I
Mm.
say I'm always open to changing as that language emerges. But right now, I just haven't been able to find a satisfactory other word that actually explains what I'm talking about. It's a very specific thing that I'm talking about.
Mm. And when we look at the split of household labor and caring or mothering work across opposite sex couples with children, we can see that parenting still remains a really gendered experience beyond pregnancy and birth, that the bulk of those duties are carried by the woman. And when we're talking about transition to motherhood compared to parenthood or fatherhood, they're very distinct categories and experiences for a lot of
Exactly.
people.
There is still work to do. And maybe one day, maybe in my lifetime, there won't be work to do. Maybe we'll be able to let go of some of those binaries. But at the moment, we still need to push against them. And so we still need to make that explicit.
Yeah, well summarized.
So baby brain is a good example of the sex differences when you are a birthing parent or a non-birthing parent. So there is a computer algorithm that can tell with 100% accuracy whether it's looking at the brain of a person who has experienced pregnancy or not. And that's, again, not gendered. It doesn't know if it's looking at a woman or a man's brain. It knows if it's looking at a brain that's been pregnant or not. And most people think that pregnancy changes happen, in breasts and bellies and that kind of thing, even, thighs and hips. But we don't really think of pregnancy being a brain changing experience, and it is. And there are lots of things that come along with that. There's a reduction in volume, and grey matter. I've often heard of baby brain as a really negative thing, being ditzy and forgetful and clumsy and stupid and, really like not a positive experience. And I think it's becoming a little bit more mainstream knowledge now. I've definitely seen lots of like TV references to this kind of thing now in a more positive way. But the understanding that there are benefits of a baby boosted brain, including more empathy and compassion, better at assessing risks and making decisions, and being better at multitasking. And, there's lots of actually good things that come along. And one of them is becoming more ambitious as well, which is certainly my case, when I was doing this work before having children compared to doing this work with children. I'm more motivated than ever before to create a better society and a better future for my children. So in the past, we've only really seen that as a negative thing. And some of these changes happen in other parents' brains, like non-birthing parents' brains, but not to the same extent. This is definitely a biological experience. I've interviewed a trans dad on my podcast, and he had actually fostered children and also biologically given birth to children. And he said, yes, his experience in his brain and personality changes was vastly different. But then he also said that gendered experience of being able to go back to work and not be judged for that, and not breastfeed and not judged for that, he also could see that was a different experience too. So it's just, we can't just pretend that men and women are the same and, that there's no big deal. Once you become pregnant, I think then you realize, oh, I can't just, compete on the same playing field. This is not the same thing. This is apples and oranges.
Yeah, pregnancy isn't just something like a little bag that you can put down and pick up at the end of the day when it suits you. Neither are children.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. It's not like you can just put on your suit and go to work and then come home and take it off. It's like, it's you. It becomes who you are.
You mentioned how your drive and your ambition is different now, having had children compared to previously. One thing that's a focus of your course early on is really taking stock of your own experience and your own stories of your personal postpartum experience, if you've had children, and your birth experience, or perhaps that of the people around you, or even your own mother when you were born. How important do you think it is to unpack our own stuff or really dive into it before we can properly serve others in parenthood and motherhood support work?
I think it's important that we are doing the work, but we don't have to have finished the work. I think something that can hold people back is thinking that they have to be like a fully perfect, healed human, and that's just not really an attainable goal. That's not how life works. But I think it's important that we're doing it concurrently, where we're aware and of our own experiences and how they might be influencing us at the same time as supporting other mums. So we don't have to be finished, but I think we have to have started.
That makes a lot of sense. And I see that nervousness or hesitation before taking a leap when there are other professionals speaking with me that I know would be brilliant, but they just don't feel like they've quite worked through their own things enough yet. And I just wonder, like, no one else can really decide what enough is except for you. If you feel that you can do a good job, then it's probably time to get cracking.
Yes, I think so. And I usually try and encourage people to use the part of the ambition that comes along with motherhood is an ambition to make the world better for other people, not just your own children, but for everyone. So I think that's kind of one way that we can be motivated. It's like, well, it's not actually about me. Right now there's someone having a baby and she's lonely and she doesn't have anyone to talk to. And here I am going, oh, I'm not ready yet. Isn't that actually a little bit selfish? And I understand there are maybe people who are genuinely experiencing some mental health challenges that really do need to be cared for, and they really do need to have supports in place. That's valid. But then there are other people who are just having crises of confidence who actually are perfectly adequate and ready, but it's more just that they've been brought up in a society that's constantly told women we aren't good enough and we'll never be good enough. Like, will you ever be ready? Really is the question. Is there a point at which you'd ever feel ready? And that's when you have to kind of ask yourself, is this a real thing that's holding me back, or is this just something that is a block, a barrier that I need to just decide not to listen to that little voice anymore?
Another block that comes up a lot, and it's come up for me, and I'm sure it will come up again and again, is that we have been consistently told that our caring work is not as valuable, first of all, and economically valuable as work that is productive, i.e., producing an end product in nature. You said to me, it's not feminism if women don't get paid. Why do we need to get paid for the work when we'd want to do it for free, essentially? How do we get past this mental stumbling block?
It's a tough one. Go and look at the data. I mean, that's a really easy one to look at. If you look at the history of women's work, they just decided when they decided to put up the GDP. And when I say they, I don't know whoever the men were in power at that time, but, lots of
And GDP is gross domestic product. So that's a measure of economic productivity.
Exactly. And when the men were all in the room, there were actually some people advocating at that time. This was around after the world wars when, we were making big philosophical decisions about the future of the world. People actually came to the table and said, we should quantify the value of women's work. We should actually put a value on that. Not women's work, caring work, and actually at the time, that idea was overridden. It was a decision to not count that in GDP as an economic contribution. And that's just how it's always been. So, go and look up the history of GDP and go and look at the economic value of unpaid labor in our society. And that's become very transparent during the pandemic. This has always been true, but it's been unavoidable in the last couple of years for people to realize the value of childcare and cleaning and education and caring for the elderly and all of those kinds of work that was not traditionally considered proper work. But this has huge economic implications. I think I read something recently that actually if we added up all the unpaid hours that women do, it would be the biggest industry in Australia. This really, really is just a decision that men made to not let us sit at the table. And so we just need to decide to sit at the table. There's no other way to do this. You can't listen to this story. You can't just accept it as a fact. We have to really dig into those, the numbers and the philosophy behind those numbers, and is it meaningful and useful to us anymore? Men aren't going to just decide, oh yeah, okay, we, after all, yeah, we'll let you have a seat at the table. I mean, why would they do that? Women just have to do it. We have to step up, and we also have to take other people with us. I feel like this is the role of privilege. As a white woman, I fight for my seat at the table, and then I try and give it to someone else who's less privileged than I am. And ideally, I see white women as kind of opening the floodgates, but not closing them behind them, letting everyone in.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of white women wellness industry gatekeeping, which is something that I'm very glad that your work does not veer into in any way. I remember when we were learning about, or perhaps when I was reading and learning about that GDP kind of story, as you explained, just the massive chasm in understanding that artificial milks and formulas and all the bottles and teats and sterilizers and everything else that goes with that, and pumps and all of those things can be counted in GDP as an economic gain, but breastfeeding and the time spent doing it is not included in any of our economic indices at all. That is regardless of the evidence that shows reduced use of hospital systems and health services over a lifetime if breastfeeding is established, maintained, and supported throughout the child's infancy, and how that translates to the mother's health as well, improved health outcomes. And so how are we going to really support our clients, our sisters, our friends, unless we are really valuing our work, because we can't pay for the things that we need to pay for to serve them unless they pay us in one way or another. So we need to pay for our childcare, we need to pay for our website, we need to pay for our own rent and food and all of those things to actually make it possible to go and serve that family. So we need to just kind of grab the bull by the horns in that sense. As you say, I don't think they're going to suddenly say, oh yeah, here's your seat, come on in, you're welcome now, and we'll pay you for all your caring work. It's not going to happen.
No, it's never going to happen. And we just have to claim it. But that's breastfeeding and bottle feeding is a really good example, because you can see, anyone who wants to look, the data is there. We know that breastfeeding has huge economic implications, but someone just decided not to add that to the spreadsheet. That's all.
And there are countries that do. It's just that ours doesn't. It's just that the main westernized, colonized economies don't do it.
Yeah, and that was a choice. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
You mentioned how you see your role as a woman who has certain levels of privilege in her life. I wanted to finish up by asking you about how you continue to run your business ethically, and how that has looked over time, perhaps as a small business sole trader, and as your influence or staffing or your turnover or whatever has grown. How has ethical practice looked different over the course of your doula career to date?
Back when I started, it was literally me going into people's homes. For many years, that was all it was, and I guess in my own life, I'm already very ethical. I consider that it's important, for example, to think about where my superannuation sits and how I'm voting and spending my money and that kind of thing. But in the very early days, in terms of my business, there wasn't much separate from me. I think there's lots of things you can do to run a sustainable business when it is just you. And that's things like that superannuation, but also just, I don't know, making an effort to have better light bulbs that use less electricity. And these all sound like small things, but if you're just doing that in your life anyway, then your business is by default just an extension of that. As I've grown bigger, I'm still a sole trader. My business is still classified as a sole trader, but I am now going to transition to a company in the next financial year. And part of that process is I'm going to look into becoming a B Corp as well. So as my business gets bigger, there becomes more moving parts. more people that I engage as consultants and that kind of thing, more countries that I'm working with, my influence grows. I think it becomes more important that there's checks and balances there. So whilst it's hard for me to kind of like prove a lot of the stuff as I'm looking through the B Corp paperwork, I'm like, well, I just do it. Like it's talking about like, charters.
Yeah. Can you explain what a B Corp is?
Yeah, so B Corp's a really interesting organization that started in America when a couple of guys started a business that was very ethical, and it was just who they were, an extension of themselves. But it wasn't, and it was built into the DNA of the business, but it wasn't a requirement of the business. The shareholders all bought into the business, and at one point the business owners wanted to sell. And in America, by law, you have to sell to the highest bidder because that's what you have to do for your shareholders. It's like an ethical obligation to your shareholders not to undersell your business. So they had to sell to the highest bidder, who they knew was going to actually then go and undermine a lot of the important ethical, environmental, and social aspects that they had built into their business. And there was no way of them guaranteeing that transition. Anyway, so what they did was set up this organization called B Corp, which will now endorse businesses as having this kind of triple bottom line approach, so that it's non-negotiable. So that if someone sells a business or someone's buying into a business as a shareholder, these are baked in to things like the charters and the training and, all of the things that mean that it can't just be changed. It can't just be thrown out by the next owner or by the next shareholder or by the next board or anything like that. It's like becomes a really integral part of the business.
And so these are things like environmental sustainability, human rights record, transparent supply chains, all of those kind of things.
Exactly. And it's a very flexible system because some businesses that are B Corps are massive retail businesses. Some of them are like, I think there's a vet who is a B Corp, so there's a wide range of businesses. So the way that they assess B Corps is very variable because some places don't have employees, some places don't sell products. So it's very flexible, but having that idea that there is social and ethical and environmental stuff built into every level of your business is important. And as my business grows, it gets harder and harder for me to kind of have eyes on everything, to really be clear on all of the moving pieces. So although most of my decisions are ethical just because that's who I am, like I said, I studied human rights, social justice at university. So it's part of everything I do. But I don't really have a way of proving that. That's why I think as I get bigger, I want to actually have a proper stamp on that and some endorsement by an outsider as an independent kind of audit, and looking at what I'm already doing, but also looking for ways to continue to improve. So I think it's definitely changes over time as my business becomes bigger than just me.
Makes sense. Great explanation. Thank you, Julia. Where is it that we can find you and find out more about your program? I know you have your Newborn Mothers podcast, which I was very happy to guest on quite some time ago. Where are we gonna find out more?
Yeah, so I can send you all these links, Anna, to pop up in the show notes, but we could pop a link to your interview on my podcast and people can follow through from there and listen to
Yeah, that'll be a blast from the past. It's about I think it's about comparing exercise and traditional postpartum care, like Western exercise rehab models and traditional postpartum care, and where they do and don't match up. So that's a topic that I don't dive into too much anymore.
No, but it was a really good one, and it's what brought you. I mean, it's kind of like a bit like a Genesis story, I guess, isn't it? You've kind of evolved beyond that now, but that was your segue into postpartum work.
Yeah, definitely. Women's health focus to begin with.
Yes. And I think I interview a lot of my graduates on my podcast because it is such an interesting story to know. Some people come through that kind of physical or professional angle. Some people come from a personal perspective of their own experiences. There's so many different ways. Some people are already midwives or social workers, but they're really feeling like they can't do the work they want to do in the system. I always find it so ironic that midwife means with woman, and the way our system is set up now, it's really hard to be with women. Yeah, it's so hard to be with women. It's interesting to listen to the podcast and hear all these different stories of how people come to this kind of work and where they're taking it, because some of my students teach online courses and some of them do home visits, some of them do classes and or yoga, massage. There's such a wide range.
And that's worth mentioning too. I know your courses attract some continuing professional development points with a few different bodies, at least here in Australia as well. Australian College of Midwives, Yoga International, and I think there's a third one that I can't.
Yeah, there's actually quite a few. And Donor International, you can get points too, which is the more international one.
That's kind of the International Doula Association for those listening.
Donor originally was Doulas of North America, and they've changed it to Donor International now to try and be international, but it is still largely in America.
Very North American, yes.
Yeah. So, and there are lots of people who've gotten professional development points for various professional associations. Often it depends on your association, but some of them will accept the endorsement of another professional association, or some of them let you have a certain amount of free choice points, per year or something. So there's lots of different ways to get this training as part of your existing work, if that's relevant. So the podcast is a great place to start. On my website, we have a free kind of like guide to just what this work looks like. It's hard for a lot of people to imagine this career. Like, what do I wear? How does it work? What do I charge? It really just feels like such a made up thing, like how do you just pull this out of nothing? And I know that feeling because that's where I started too. So that's another thing, is like, is this work right for you, and what are the next steps? Is a little free guide that people can download off the website.
Perfect. And I know on the training site there's a list of all the 6 modules, and it talks about the kind of the business bonus module at the end and all of that kind of thing too. So we'll pop those links up for you. Is there any final parting words that you want to leave us with, Julia?
I just want to encourage people to do this work. And I don't mean as a profession or to do my training or anything, but to do the work of changing the way our culture views motherhood. I assume your listeners are largely parents.
Primarily, yeah.
Yeah. And so anyone can contribute to changing these conversations and the way that we view families and the value of caring work and that kind of thing. You don't have to be a postpartum doula to be changing perceptions around postpartum care. And often that starts with you. What is it that, if you're a new parent and you're struggling, what kind of things could you do to embrace your new brain and personality, or to get the support, build your village, and once we start making these changes in our own lives. I know one thing is such a small example. I don't actually have a cleaner at the moment because of various COVID disruptions and my children getting older and contributing more. When they were little, I always had a cleaner. And I remember so many mums would come to my house and I'd say I had a cleaner, and they'd be like, oh my gosh, that kind of like would give them permission to pay for help as well. And these were rich people. There was no question of them affording it. It was more just like they felt it was part of their identity as a woman to be responsible for all of the work.
Yeah, I worked with a business mentor for a time, and she said, if you're a mum in business, the first staff member you should get is not any kind of business assistant. It needs to be a cleaner.
That was definitely my first hire, for sure. Long before I could afford it. It was a real stretch for us. When I did start out, we were like at a stage where it was hard to pay rent, and I did feel excluded from mothers groups and things because I couldn't afford to buy a coffee. But as soon as I had, even just like $40 a month spare, I was like, okay, that's an hour of cleaning.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it was really, exactly. That was a really important investment for me. So I think often when we make these changes in our own life, we can see it actually as a gift to other mothers, to realize that we can do things differently, and we can make different choices, and that it doesn't have to look like this huge burden of independence and overwhelm, just contributing to that different way of looking at things.
Beautifully said. Thank you so much for your time, Julia.
Thanks, Anna. Bye.
Thank you so much for listening to this podcast. I hope you loved it as much as I loved recording and editing it for you. If you feel called, I would really appreciate if you could leave a 5-star review or a rating. This is how more and more people find out about this content. If you would like to become a supporter of the podcast, head to www.annacusack.com.au/podcast and take a look around the site for my free offerings and for my book as well. Any links to resources from today are in the show notes, and feel free to continue the conversation with me on social media at any time. @Anna Cusack Postpartum is where you'll find me. Bye.